Good to see everybody this evening. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we kind of began this last Wednesday and talking about this. And I talked to you a little bit about the idea last Wednesday that, to me, in a lot of ways, this is kind of the aha or the summation chapter. As Paul's kind of been in a kind of approaching his conversation in an odd way, right? He's talking about, let me talk to you foolishly for a while, and let me make some comparisons that you might think are foolish for me to make. And he does all this, and then he kind of gets to this chapter, and then we kind of go, oh, okay, that's why he did it that way. That's why he approached that conversation with that style. And so one of the things that we noted last week is that ultimately Paul says that what had God given him or allowed for him to have? Okay, so he had what he simply calls a thorn in the flesh. And we talked a little bit last week about this basic fact, and with that, we talked about the fact we don't exactly know what that might be. There's various things that it could be, but it's not necessarily specifically noted here, obviously, in this particular text. But what it does help us appreciate is that this thorn in the flesh may very well have been why it was that people viewed him as what when he was physically present with them? As weak, right? It kind of helps summarize that, right? It kind of helps give us an idea that he's not just arbitrarily mentioning this thorn in the flesh. He mentions it after this long conversation he's had with them as to why they should quit judging him based on his lack of physical prowess when he's there. And then he kind of says, in some ways, here's why. Here's why I don't have this physical strength and prowess when I come to places. And so this, whatever it was, and here's kind of where we left off on Wednesday, whatever it was, Paul did what according to verse 8? Okay. He asked that it be removed or depart from him, and he did that in what fashion? That's a poor way to ask that. How many times? 3 times. Okay. So 3 times he said, I besought the Lord thrice that it might depart from me. Sound familiar? Yeah, what's it sound familiar to? All right, Jesus in the garden. We actually talked about that Sunday morning in our sermon. That sounds a lot like what Jesus had done, right? That 3 times he besought the Father that let this cup pass from me. If Paul's familiar with that, then he would undoubtedly maybe feel like if the Lord offered 3 prayers and that was sufficient in a sense to kind of draw a conclusion that was not in the plans that God had, then it was sufficient for Paul. After the 3rd time, he asked to have this thorn in the flesh removed. And that wasn't the answer that God gave him, but what is the answer according to verse 9? Okay, so rather than allowing for or letting this depart from him, notice that he said that he says, God told me instead that my grace is sufficient for you. We would want, if we were in the same position, we might ask for the very same thing. He wants rid of it, right? I'm hoping that this thorn in the flesh will depart from me. And sometimes, just like Paul in our lives, we have to accept the fact that grace is what? Is enough. It's sufficient. I don't always get the exact remedy that I'm looking for, but I always receive the grace of God to help strengthen, comfort, and encourage me through whatever that challenge is. Obviously, you have a thorn in the flesh that, again, contextually, I'm arguing was a reason why Paul didn't have much of a physical presence when he arrives in all these various cities and places that he's preaching the gospel. And I can imagine maybe he did want that for his travel's sake, for his presence sake, for all the above, right? But what I appreciate about Paul is that when he finishes praying 3 different occasions to have it removed, he accepted the answer, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect when?"
That's the reason.
Okay. So my strength, and the only reason I spelled that right is because I was looking at it. So my strength is made perfect in weakness. How is that possible? How can weakness be ever considered a strength?
When you're self-sufficient, you can do everything all by yourself and all that. Humans tend to have a lesser leaning on the Lord. If you have something wrong with you, or it can be physical, it can be mental, it can be anything, you tend to lean more upon the Lord because, like when you're young, you think, "Oh, hey, I can do this, I can do that," and when you're older, you learn that you're alive and all you have, all your blessings come from God, not from what you've done.
Okay. So part of that equation is that sometimes when we become so self-sufficient, we may not think that we even need God within that system. Think about it from Paul's perspective as well, though. Here, so he wants it removed, but he also learns through that process that if he has it removed, he may not rest upon the power of Jesus anymore. Because that's his words. "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." It's an interesting kind of thing. I have no doubt in my mind that if Paul had received exactly what he asked for, that he would have done the right thing. By glorying in whom? In the God who provided it. Now maybe you say that's presumptuous, Brian, and maybe you're right. Maybe that's speculation, probably is. But every ounce of Paul's character seems to indicate to me that if he had received exactly what he'd asked for, he would have given God the glory for it. No indication from the life of Paul, at least after his conversion, that would make us think anything other than that. But Paul also recognized something within himself. Because he said, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmity." Rather than having an opportunity to glory that God had provided for him a permanent answer to his thorn in the flesh, he said, "Rather, I'll glory in my infirmities," because that will allow him then to have to continually trust in the power of Jesus. It will be a constant reminder of where his dependency really lies. In fact, add verse 10, "Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." When I face any of the above, Paul says there in verse 10, when I face any of those kinds of things, and I turn and look at the strength that Jesus is providing as I resolve and deal with all of these basic calamities and challenges, Paul says, I find benefit in that. I find benefit in reminding myself on a daily basis that I need the Savior. I need the strength that comes through Jesus. And if everything was easy, then we might fall prey to the idea that I didn't need anything. And so it's an interesting perspective Paul has. But again, I still believe it's said under the envelope of the whole conversation. Paul, why would you do that? Remember what he did in chapter 11? We listed all that stuff. perils in the waters, perils in the country, perils everywhere he went, difficulties, beaten with rods, left to die, all those things that he listed, all trying to encourage them to realize that, listen, if you want a resume for somebody to be able to evidence to you that you ought to be listening to the things that they're sharing, my resume is a mile long. That's what Paul's basically saying. Are they Hebrews? I'm a Hebrew. Do they have a... So Paul just basically writes his resume in chapter 11 of why it is they should listen. Now he's turned it over and saying, listen, you may look at it as a weakness. When I show up and I don't have the great presence that you think I should have based on the way that I write, what you see as weakness, I call it a what? A strength. What you see as a hindrance, I see as something to rather glory in, to find pleasure in. Because the very things that you all look at and see in me, that you keep thinking that I can't be the apostle that I'm claiming to be. I can't have the real message of Jesus behind what I'm saying, because look at him. That's the context of the letter. Paul says, what you're calling weakness, I'm calling strengths. What you're calling infirmities, I'm saying I glory in them. Find pleasure in them. Because those are the things that actually keep me connected to Jesus. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Generally speaking, when people have those kinds of troubles and they don't get the answers they were looking for when they prayed or whatever it might be, what's often the temptation or what often occurs? Yeah, they blame God or they leave, right? It's an interesting example here, isn't it? Paul says the very things that many people today would leave God over are the very things that's drawing him closer to God. The very things that many folks have abandoned Jesus for are the very things that are pulling Paul closer to Jesus every step of the way. Great little lesson to learn as it relates to the things that Paul's sharing with us here. That everything's reversed from what people were thinking. They were judging according to the appearance. They were judging based on his weaknesses, never giving a thought that those weaknesses were actually his strengths, never giving a thought that those very weaknesses were the things that were keeping him solid in his relationship with Jesus. It's just kind of an interesting way that he finally comes to a summation, if you will, of all the things that he's been sharing. Thoughts, questions?
These infirmities he has would make him try harder to overcome them and get the gospel to the people.
Yeah, it certainly compels him to continue to preach and make sure that he doesn't let those things become hindrances to the process of the gospel.
Not just a strength for him, it's a strength for anybody that witnesses.
Yeah.
He's a living example of how they should be doing.
Yeah. He is an absolute walking example of how you can overcome infirmity with nothing but the grace of God working with you. Didn't have anything to do with how you physically handle it in the sense of being able to find healing or a miracle, whatever it might be that Paul, but just to watch and witness him handle things with the strength of the grace of God behind him is a perfect example for anyone who come. And again, they're arguing it's not, and he's trying to get them to see, yes, it is. You should be looking at these things as something to evidence who I am, not to deteriorate who you think I am.
What they would think, that's what the devil did to Job. You protected him, take the protection away. If they're looking for a life where they don't have any problems, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And just to add a thought to that too, and I think that's probably a mistake that those who were contemporaries with the apostles made. It's probably a mistake that others could make as well in more modern times. But if we have a concept that just take the immediate apostles of Jesus for an example, if those immediate apostles of Jesus still get sick, still get hurt, still have problems, still have all the difficulties then that somehow says that Jesus isn't real or that Jesus can't. We've missed the point. All that shows is that even the apostles have the same dependency on the grace of God that everybody else does. And that the power that they had been endued with was never for selfish ambition or selfish purposes. You know, it's interesting that Paul, it doesn't say that he asked that God allow him to perform a miracle on himself. I've often wondered, you know, you think about the power that the apostles had, and you think about all the people they helped, all the while they themselves were facing difficulties and challenges, and they never did it for themselves in that process. It's an interesting kind of situation. You know, you think about how they were constantly being of benefit to others and performing all kinds of, but never for selfish reasons. The grace of God was sufficient. And again, he is a perfect example of that. That's right. And yeah, he went like the rest of us. He used the same mechanism that the rest of us have. Even though he's an apostle. That's a great example for those in Corinth. Yes, I'm exactly who I've claimed to be, but I use the same tools and methods that you use in order to receive strength and encouragement. Go ahead, Andy. Sure. Sure.
Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And then in verse 3 says, not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope.
That's right. And that's a great example there, Danny, in that text in Romans chapter 5, because Paul wrote that. And Paul's not telling those in Rome something he wasn't living out every day. That he gloried in tribulation, just like he was encouraging them to do. He gloried in his tribulations. He sought after the grace of God through his faith. He was a living example of the very things he was preaching, not just to Corinth, but to places like Rome. Verse 11. So back into this odd kind of conversation. So he says, I have become a fool in glorying. You have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended of you, for in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. And I'll tell you the word. Here's the word that came to my mind when I read that verse, after all these other things that Paul has said. And I'll explain why. But here's the word that came to my mind. I think that's one of the most stinging things that Paul could say to them. Think about what he just said. I became a fool in all this glorying about all the things I've faced, challenges I've dealt with, difficulties I've encountered, places I've been that caused trouble, all these things, and I never should have had to have said any of it. That's what he said. I shouldn't have had to have said any of this. You compelled me to have to do that. The way you were reacting to me, the way you were believing what these other people were saying about me when they were coming into Corinth, and the deceptions they used and the lies that they told you about me and all of that, he says, you forced me in a sense. You've compelled me to have to go down this road, for I ought to have never had to do that. In fact, I should have been what? Commended. Lots of application for me in this text. And I don't mean necessarily personally, I just mean thought. Paul says, you should have never had any doubt about who I was. I've given you enough evidence. You let guys that you don't even know come into Corinth and convince you of things about me, and you know me. You know the way I behaved when I came to Corinth. You know that I robbed other churches while I was there so that I could be sure that you didn't think I was worldly minded and there for money. I suffered hardship and challenge to get there and to do all the things that I've done. I preached to you the purity of the message of Jesus Christ, and I didn't withhold anything from you. You had every reason to know exactly who I was. I ought to have been commended. When somebody said something about Paul, they should have instantaneously said, that's not true. Paul should have been the one receiving the benefit of the doubt. And friends, there are probably times in our lives where we're guilty of the same thing. Where somebody comes and tells us something about somebody, in the back of our mind we go, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound at all. Now, I'm not arguing that there are perfect people out there that never make mistakes and could never get caught up in something. That's not what I'm saying. But what's our first instinct? That's right. Isn't that a shame? We've known people for years, and we hear the first bad thing and we go, Rather than relying upon the 20, 25 years of what we've known about that person. Now, if facts finally come to the surface, if the church in Corinth finally finds that Paul has been a deceptor and led them away from the gospel rather than to it, then they would have every reason to push him and his thoughts and his teachings aside. But their first inclination, based on every evidence they already had, should have been to receive Paul and to commend him when somebody began to say something different about him. We should probably do more of the same. Our first instinct should be to trust what we know about somebody, what they've already evidenced themselves to be, and maybe in some way stand up for them. And then if there's evidence to the contrary that eventually comes to full knowledge, but not based on just what somebody said to me when they walked up to me.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah. And that should be particularly true, Jeff. It should be true all the time, but it should be particularly true with people we know. Right? And that's what Paul says here to them. I'm not behind any of the chiefest apostles. Though I'm nothing, not glorying in myself, Paul says. But I'm not behind even the chiefest of apostles, and you should have known that. Signs and wonders that he did in front of them should have evidenced it. The manner in which he behaved, the evidence of the message that he presented. And so maybe that's a lesson for all of us. And talking to myself here as well. That maybe when we know and the evidence of somebody's character and life is telling me otherwise, then maybe the first inclination should be to commend that person. And if then there's a body of evidence that shows to the contrary, we can always address that then. But sometimes, people like Paul here, Paul's, he's having to recommend himself to the very people he presented the gospel to. That church wouldn't even be there if Paul hadn't gone. It's interesting. Yeah, and I say it that way because I want you to feel that frustration. We don't always see it in Paul's writings, but it comes out once in a while. That verse to me is a verse where his frustration comes out. We should have never got to this point. In other words, Paul says, I shouldn't have had to write the last, 4 or 5 chapters? I shouldn't have had to write any of that. But you all compelled me to have to evidence and prove who I was to you again. It's sad, really. It really is sad. Because truly the signs of an apostle, verse 12, were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. Every evidence that he was an apostle was shown to them. Everything they needed. And nothing that anybody could have said should have persuaded them away from that basic understanding. I was patient. I did the signs and the wonders, mighty deeds, things that were done in your presence, should have pointed you and helped you understand with confidence of exactly who Paul was. So when the evidence is there, and again back to that prior conversation, all the evidence points to Paul's exactly who he says he was. He's an apostle. The guy comes along and says something. Well, where's this evidence? Paul's already given you all the evidence he's an apostle. Where's this guy's evidence that somehow Paul isn't what he claimed to be or showed himself to be? They didn't have anything. What'd they have? Well, he writes bold, but he's not very strong when he shows up. You think about that, right? They point to one negative thing. He's bodily weak. And they let that one negative thing overrule all the wonders, signs, message, mighty deeds, everything that Paul had done, showing himself an apostle. It goes back to that thought, right? Jump to that negative, and boy, it just carries the day. And it's a shame. It's especially a shame in this circumstance with Paul and the church of Corinth. Thoughts, questions? I'll slow down. I'll come back, Nanny. Go ahead.
Seems like he's always constantly having to prove himself.
Yeah.
All this time.
Yeah. And it's a shame that he has to go back and do it over and over again. Go ahead, Danny.
I just recommend that the class, not right now, but later on, go back to Acts chapter 18 and read that chapter.
Yeah.
It talks about Paul being there, some of the things that he went through, and there's things that God expressed to him that played a big part in him being successful in what he done.
Yeah. You go back and you read the parallels to when he actually was, and you in the record of the Acts of the Apostles, and you can see exactly in some ways what he's talking about, and the things that he did in those locations.
Paul's actually given hints of this if you go through the first few chapters of 2 Corinthians. Like in 4, he said, "So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away." You know, he's given hints of this throughout. The biggest thing is that he's talking to carnally minded people, because a carnally minded person will believe something negative about someone faster than they'll believe something positive.
Yeah. And that carnal thinking has been weighing on their challenges from start to finish. Any other thoughts or comments up to that point? So verse 13. For what is it wherein you were inferior to other churches, except it be that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Ouch.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, it sounds like a little more frustration coming out.
Yeah, so he says to them, in what way were you different than the other churches that I sat? In what way, or what is it that makes you inferior? Is there anything different about you that is different from all the other churches that I was establishing and working with? And Paul says, there was one thing that made you different. And that was, I never took anything to sustain me. You think about that. Again, think big picture for a minute. You convinced yourself that I'm not an apostle because I'm physically weak. And yet you didn't do anything to help a physically weak man when he was physically in your presence. I was never burdensome to you. I didn't take anything. Remember the earlier statement, I robbed other churches to do you service. If you don't think there's sarcasm in the Bible, forgive me this wrong. Sarcasm, in my humble opinion. I've made you inferior because I wasn't burdened. He's the ouch, right? The frustration now was coming out. Behold, the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I seek not yours, but you. Despite all this, I'm willing to what, Paul says? Yeah, I'm willing to come back. And I'm not only willing to come back, but I didn't say all these things so that this time you'll pay me. When I come back again, I'm going to do it the very same way I did the other times.
I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah. I will still not be burdensome to you, because all I want is for you to learn and appreciate the message of the gospel. And then he uses an interesting parallel, doesn't he? He says, for I seek not yours. I don't want what you have. I don't want you to compensate me. But I want you, for the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. Paul uses what's a common understanding. And he does that because he thinks of himself as what to them, by the way? As a father. Okay. So he thinks of himself or sees himself as a father unto them, and that would make them children. By the way, I think we could probably make that argument. Paul feels that way about every place he went and preached to God. You see that similar kind of language with other places. And so he says, the natural, for lack of a better word, the common, maybe that's a better word, the common order of things is that parents leave behind an inheritance for the children, not vice versa. And so Paul's trying to, again, we can overreach here, right? We can turn the text into something that it's not. I don't think that Paul's trying to say, now, everybody here that's got children, get a savings account because you're responsible to make sure you leave something to your children. That is not what Paul's saying. It's not his point. It's not his point. I could tell you the conversations I've had with my own children. Never mind. But he's trying to illustrate that, especially when you're dealing with parents and what kind of children? Young children. Think of it more in that imagery. It's the obligation of the parents to lay up, to provide for the children, not those young children in that household taking care, because that's the imagery. I'm not going to be burdensome to you. I'm not going to expect you to take care of me when I get there. In fact, because I think of myself as a father and you as my children, it isn't your responsibility in that context of comparison for you to be doing that. That's his point. So he's trying to just simply get us to understand a relationship that he has with those in Corinth. He's not teaching a principle about what every parent in the world should be doing as it relates to. He's using a common understanding to illustrate a point. And the common understanding is parents lay up to help their children. That's what I want to do for you, Paul says when he arrives there. And I will very gladly spend and be spent for you. Though the more abundantly I love you, ouch. the less I be loved. Frustration. Right? Now again, I'm trying not to turn this too much to, because his relationship to them is spiritual, although he is talking about physical things, because he says, I'm not going to be burdensome to you when he arrives there. But we've seen evidence of that, right? We know what that looks like. I've seen parents go hundreds of miles, and I don't mean literal miles, but I just mean in terms of effort. They have gone hundreds of miles in effort to do what they can for their children, but if you watch the reaction and behaviors of the children, you would never know it. And just as sad as it is for us to witness it in our modern times, it's the same frustration Paul's experiencing with those in Corinth. And yet he says what? I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to do it. I'm still ready to spend and be spent. Though the more abundantly I love, the more evidence of my love for you is there on a regular basis. It feels like the less I be, that he feels loved in response to them. Again, I'm trying not to overreach because he's got a mindset, right? He's working on within a context of reason why he's using these kinds of comparisons. And so sometimes you can see the comparison and we make too much application out of the comparison rather than out of what actually he's comparing it to. But Paul wants them to understand that it hurts that he doesn't seem to have much respect coming from them. That there's not much love coming from them, though he's the one been making all the sacrifices. He's the one been doing all the work. He's the one putting all the effort in. He's the one doing everything he can. And it doesn't seem to be appreciated or loved or anything. And it's wrong. And I think Paul's trying to tell them it's wrong without just coming out and saying, what's the matter with you? He doesn't say this with glowing, it's okay kind of mindset. It's not okay. And I think that's within kind of his descriptor here. He's telling them, listen, this is not okay. You should not be responding to me this way. You should not be treating me this way. It's not okay then. It's not okay today. It's not okay. And yet Paul says from a sacrificial standpoint, as a father with his children, he'll keep persevering through that because he loves them as his children, regardless of their lack of respect and admiration for him when they should have had. Did I make a gain of you by any of them whom I sent unto you? It's interesting. Paul just kind of peels back the layers, right? And he says, so you can't point to anything personally I did to try to gain my own personal benefit. I didn't send anybody back later in order to receive some benefit from you. Reminds me a little bit. Remember, I wish I could remember it. So remember the account of Naaman? Naaman goes dipped 7 times. He wants to give the prophet something. The prophet says not going to take it. But the servant goes back and takes it. Isn't that the right account? It's interesting, isn't it? Paul says, I didn't do that. I didn't leave and say, I don't want anything, and then send somebody back to do the collection. Paul says, you've had no reason to treat me the way you've treated me. I've done nothing but love and give. And it's really sad. I'll come back to that next Wednesday, but it's really sad to see how they have pushed Paul to such a low depth that he has to even pen these things and say them to them. I would hope it would sting like crazy. And then I would hope they would change as it relates to it. All right, Lord willing, we'll come back, finish this chapter up next Wednesday.